Hello, in this video, we are going to be talking about the final days of Jesus. Really, chapters 26 of Matthew all the way through the end of Matthew. And we're going to be really diving into the walk toward Jesus's crucifixion, and then also that time after the burial and then the resurrection. So we have a lot of territory to cover. So we'll try to do this as quickly as possible. So first things first, just remembering what's happened up to this point. You've seen Jesus's really, really strong, powerful ministry in Galilee, and you've seen him have that strong ministry in the area around the Sea of Galilee. And then he slowly moved toward Judea and Jerusalem. And up to this point now we've zoomed in on his ministry there in Jerusalem and the final week or so of his life. So now, in the midst of that, we're going to see this plot to kill Jesus, because now he's in Jerusalem, he's in the center of power, he's at this Passover feast, and it's just very clear just how much he opposes the religious leaders and is a threat to their power. So when Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days, the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion." At that time, the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the courtyard of the high priest named Caiaphas. And they plotted together to arrest Jesus covertly and kill him, But they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise a riot might occur among the people. So you have this threat of civil unrest, the sense in which if we take action against Jesus, then you're going to have action against us. If we take action against Jesus, then they're going to try to, the mob, the crowds are going to be violent and attack us. Now, for some of you, this may be confusing because you think about the violent crowd at Jesus's trial, but it's important to see that that's most likely supporters of the Pharisees and Sadducees and chief priests, the people who want to get rid of Jesus. The concern here that they're expressing is when he's walking through Jerusalem during the day, most of the time, there is crowds around him, learning from him, wanting to know about him. There are all these crowds that are loyal to Jesus, and they're afraid that if they were to pounce on Jesus and seize him where everyone could see, that there would be a riot, that the crowds would riot. And it's not unusual to have riots in Jerusalem during Passover. This is not something that is totally unheard of. So they're scared. We have to wait until after the Passover. At this point, Jerusalem during the Passover is filled with as many people as it's going to have just about all year. This is one of the big festivals that you have in Jerusalem, and you have huge amounts of people. The city's population is swelled to much larger than it normally is. And many of these people are from areas that are walking distance, areas that Jesus has ministered. Many of these people are loyal to Jesus. Unlike after the festival, when many of these people will go home, and it'll mainly be supporters of the high priest and his supporters, the Sadducees. So they say, we're not going to do this during the festival. But of course, ultimately, they are going to attack Jesus during the festival. So what changes? Well, you're going to see here within the same chapter what changes. So next thing is, now when Jesus was in Bethany, again, this is a town really close to Jerusalem. When Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster vial. So this is a very expensive perfume called nard. A very expensive perfume, and she poured it on his head, and he reclined at the table. But the disciples were indignant when they saw this, and they said, "Why waste this? This perfume could have been sold for a high price and the money be given to the poor." Now, of course, John, in John's gospel, says that there's one specific apostle that had a problem with this, and that it was Judas, and it's because he oversaw the money pot and that he had been stealing from the money pot. So that is just a little bit of context from one of the other gospels for this passage. So Jesus was aware of this, and he said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a good deed for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. For when she poured this perfume on my body, she's preparing me for burial." So this is that continued theme. Jesus has been saying it for many, many, many chapters. I'm going to die. This is what's happening. Jesus knows what's coming. It's still something that's lost on everyone because they don't want to accept it. Truly, I say to you that wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will be told in memory of her. So you have this picture of him saying, look, I'm going to die, and it's going to be the kind of thing where there's not going to be a lot of time to prepare my body. So she's preparing my body ahead of time. So this becomes deeply symbolic. But it also seems to be the time, the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, the final action that leads Judas to say, that's it, I'm done. So remember, he knows that the chief priests, the high priest, wants to attack Jesus, but they don't know how to get to him because the crowds are always around him. But Judas actually gives them an opportunity to mitigate their risk, to get around that issue. So then one of the 12, named Jesus Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me to betray him to you? Now, if you take into context what John says about them being able to have possibly sold that perfume for like 300 denarii, and that selling that perfume would have gone in the money chest, and that's what Judas would have been in charge of. It kind of makes sense that he just lost this opportunity to make money, and now he's a very immoral person, and he is going to betray Jesus. There's also some spiritual warfare going on here of him being influenced by Satan. And they set out before him 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, he looked for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. So this idea of the opportunity is really important, because remember, when Jesus is walking about teaching, crowds are surrounding him. Pro-Jesus crowds are surrounding him. So what they need is, the priests need a time to be able to attack Jesus when it's only a small group of his closest followers, where it's not a whole big crowd. And Judas can give them that. Judas knows Jesus's routine. Judas knows where Jesus is, when he's there, and when to get Jesus when he's got the least amount of protection. So that's why Judas matters. So now, on the day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, where do you want us to prepare for the Passover? So just a reminder, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is this feast that precedes Passover, in which people remove all leaven. That's yeast. That's what makes bread rise. They remove all of this from their house. And this symbolizes, in the Old Testament, it symbolizes the fact that when the people of Israel fled from Egypt in the book of Exodus, they did not have time to allow their bread to rise. They had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. So they did not put leaven in their bread. Also later on, in Christian circles, leaven comes to represent sin. But in this particular case, it is a callback to Exodus. So they're in this Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they're looking toward the Passover. Now, the Passover, again, is an ancient Jewish festival dating back to Exodus, in which the people of Israel commemorate when God sent the angel of death over Egypt, and because they had sacrificed the Passover lamb, the Israelites had sacrificed the Passover lamb, and they put the blood on the doorposts. Because of that, the angel of death passed over the Israelites, and it took the firstborn of the Egyptians. So, in this particular case, we have a picture here of, now they're about to act out these festivals, remembering the great work that God has done. Now, this is going to be particularly important because Jesus is going to be compared to a Passover lamb. And Jesus's sacrifice is going to be set up as an example of he died as the Passover lamb, and God's wrath passed over those people who put their faith in Jesus, who the Passover lamb. And so the wrath of God will pass over us who put our faith in him. So that's a very beautiful picture of who Jesus is this concept of Passover. So he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am keeping the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus said and directed them, and he prepared the Passover. So they're going to have the Passover. Now, when evening came, Jesus was reclined at the table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. Being deeply grieved, they began saying to him, each one, surely it is not I. And he answered, he who dips his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. And the Son of Man is going away, just as it is written about him. But woe to the man by whom the Son of God is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. And Judas, who was betraying him, said, surely not I, Rabbi. And Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. So we shouldn't think at this point that anybody else knows what's going on, because they all have dipped their hand in the bowl with him. Any of the disciples could be it. And when Judas, who knows he's going to betray him, does this whole kind of pantomime and does the same thing everybody else does. Surely not I, Rabbi. Everyone else said the same thing. Jesus' response is, you've said it yourself. We aren't really to take that all of a sudden everybody was like, oh, it's Judas. Judas is going to betray him. That's not the picture we get here. It seems like Judas and Jesus kind of nod, wink, wink, get what's going on here. But that the others don't. Especially because you think Peter probably would have attacked him then and there. Now, while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, take and eat, this is my body. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is the blood of my covenant, which is being poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, do not drink, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now or until that day when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. Now, if we look at this in the Passover, you would have multiple types of drink and food here. But in this particular case, we've got bread, and the bread represents Jesus's body, and the blood or the wine represents Jesus's blood. And this is a very strong case of symbolism. Now, some people, particularly those in a more Catholic tradition, will argue no, that in a special way, this actually, the body and the blood, when it's blessed, the bread and the wine, when it's blessed, are actually transubstantiated. They're changed to be literal blood and literal flesh, and in a special way. Not that you're tasting blood and flesh, but that in a special way it is. And also, if you look at other writers like Luther and others who will put with something like in a special way, it's not, they don't become blood, they don't become bread, but the bread and the blood are with, the flesh and the blood are with those elements. Again, I think the reality here is that it's symbolic. And they'll argue as he doesn't say it's symbolic, he says it is. And then my point is, this is how metaphor works, right? This is how symbolism works. With respect to those who are in that Catholic tradition or Lutheran tradition or other traditions, this is how symbolism works. There's all kinds of symbolism within Jewish rituals, right? The Passover itself is symbolism, right? That lamb is not literally the lamb that was sacrificed all those years ago, but it represents that sacrifice, right? All of the different rituals that are done during Passover represent or symbolize what was done before. And that's the same picture you have here. It makes total sense within what Passover is. It is a symbolic or representative gesture that reminds the people of God's deliverance. So all you see Jesus doing here is expanding on that tradition of symbolizing or representing the acts in the past, so that future generations will get it. So we see here, and you'll notice if you go back and read Exodus, right before Exodus, right before the Passover actually happens, the angel of death actually comes, they're given this really strong description of what they're going to do for Passover, and told basically, this is what you're going to do, and you're not going to just do it this night, you're going to do it for future nights, and it's going to be a future ceremony. That's what Jesus is doing right now. Just like that future act of the Passover, he's saying, look, there's something really awesome about to happen, really amazing about to happen. That's my death, burial, and resurrection. You are going to commemorate that event with this ceremony. It's a commemoration, just like Passover. And they would have very much understood that context of commemorative meals. It's a commemoration of what God is about to do that people will continue throughout the history. Again, there's some people who would very much disagree with me, and they have arguments and reasons for that. You have to kind of take those as they come and deal with those arguments as they come. So, now right after this, you're going to see them go to the Mount of Olives. Okay. Now, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. You can go there now. I've been there. This is a place you can go to this day, to the Mount of Olives. It's a very commanding view of Jerusalem, and there is an olive orchard there with all these olive trees, this kind of garden there that you can go to. And Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have raised, go ahead. I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Again, they still seem to not get it. They'll go ahead to Galilee. So Galilee is where most of Jesus's ministry took place. But Peter replied and said to him, even if they will all fall away because of you, I will not fall away. So Peter has this very strong commitment. I'm not going to leave you, Jesus. And Jesus said to him, Truly I say to you that this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. All of the disciples said the same as well. So you get the picture of what's happening. So he's at the Mount of Olives. He's going to go to this Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane. And you have this whole interaction where he's like, he wants them to pray with him. He takes Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, who's kind of his inner circle of 3 people. He wants them to pray with him, but they keep falling asleep. And he goes beyond them and he's going to pray. And he's basically going to say, hey, look, I need you guys to pray with me. He says, and he went a little beyond them and he fell on his face, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour. And keep watching and praying so that you may not come into temptation. So he's asking them to pray so they're not tempted. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And you really see a repeat of this. This kind of repeats, and ultimately they're not able to endure. And then comes the betrayal. And then while he was there speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. So what do we have? He's alone. He's got a small group of his followers. He's not surrounded by crowds because it's at night, right after the Passover. And now you have this crowd, essentially a mob, coming up, being used in order to take control of Jesus. There's a possibility that we have soldiers in this crowd as well, or temple guards as well here. Likelihood, not really a possibility. That's almost certainly the case. And now, he who was betraying him gave the sign previously saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, arrest him. So then Jesus is going to kiss him, which again, understand in the Middle East at this time, kissing, like a kiss on the cheek or something like that, was as a common way of greeting someone. This is not what we would think of today. A man kissing another man has a very particular connotation. But in this culture, to grab someone and kiss them on their cheek is actually a pretty typical greeting to someone. So to betray Jesus with a greeting of love and compassion and care is really a true betrayal. Just to understand how deep this betrayal is that Jesus is experiencing. And behold, one of those men who were with Jesus reached out, drew his sword, and struck a slave of the high priest and cut his ear. Now we know from another gospel that it's Peter. And Jesus said to him, Peter did the striking. And Jesus said to him, put your sword back in its place, for all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal 12 legions of soldiers? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way? So Jesus is saying, look, we're not going to fight this out. I knew this was coming. This has to happen. I could have called up 12 legions to defend me if I wanted to. 12 legions of angels. Now understand, this is a legion. A Roman legion tends to be somewhere around roughly 5,000 soldiers, give or take, depending on the type of legion. It varies which type of soldiers. We don't have to get too far into that. But, well, 5,000 soldiers, we're looking at 60,000 soldiers here. This is a huge army. And he says, this is how many soldiers I could have, or angels I could have fighting for me right now if I wanted. But this is not what I want. This is not what God wants. So then at that time, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a man inciting a revolt? Every day I used to sit within the temple grounds teaching, but you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so the scripture of the prophets would be fulfilled. And the disciples left and fled. And this gets to that point again. Why didn't they attack him in the temple? That's where they had the most strength. It's really the temple authorities that are trying to attack him. Why is it that they didn't attack him there? Because the crowds. That's where everyone else would be. So they don't have enough supporters to support them against Jesus. But now, what are they going to do? They're going to attack Jesus at night. When he's not near the crowds, they're going to take him to the temple complex, which at night is closed off. You don't have all those crowds. And they're going to try to do all of these things when Jesus doesn't have his supporters. And then they're going to try to put him before Pilate, again, when he doesn't have the same level of support. And they're going to try to basically, once they have him in custody, they can do the narrative. They can say things about him that aren't true. They can set the narrative. They can apply false witnesses. These are all things that they're able to do now because they caught him away from his one protection, which was the crowds. So now Jesus before Caiaphas, the high priest. So those who arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter, following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and he came inside and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the entire council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus. So they're trying to set the narrative. They're trying to get false witnesses. Jesus is not really getting a proper defense here, so that they may put him to death. If they did not find any, even through many false witnesses that came forward. But later, two came forward and said, this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, one thing to note here is the question is, who did Jesus say something like that to? Now, Jesus said that, but he was talking about his own body. He said, I'm able to destroy this temple, his own body, and raise it in 3 days. Who did he say that to? He said it to his disciples. This might be Judas kind of giving, oh, say this kind of thing. And the high priest stood up and said to him, do you offer no answer to these men who are testifying against you? And Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I place you under oath by the living God to tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. The accusation here is, are you Messiah? If you're the Messiah, if you claim to be the Messiah, let's go ahead and kill you right now. That's the idea. You're a threat. And Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming into the clouds. What did he just do? He said, hey, yes, you've said it. And adding on to that, I'm going to be sitting at the right hand of power. Basically saying I'm sitting at the right hand of God, and I'm going to be coming in the clouds from heaven. He is saying, he's basically, at this point, he barely says anything. And the one thing he says is, basically, I'm the Messiah, and I'm coming in God's wrath. That's going to be happening. And the high priest tore his robes. He has blasphemed. What further need do we have witnesses? See, you now have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, he deserves death. And they spit in his face, and they beat him with fists, and they slapped him and said, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that hit you? So they're accusing him of being a false Christ. So now Peter was sitting outside the courtyard. A slave woman came to him and said, you who were Jesus the Galilean, you were with Jesus the Galilean. And he denied it before them, saying, I do not know what you were talking about. When they had gone out to the gateway, another slave woman saw him and said to him there, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And he denied it with an oath. I do not know that man. Did not know the man. A little later, bystanders came up to Peter and said, you really are one of them as well, since your talk gives you away. He has an accent of a Galilean. And he began to curse and swear, I do not know that man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the statement that Jesus had made, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he wept bitterly. So we have this ultimate betrayal of Peter. He's not only betrayed by Judas, he's also denied by Peter. So now we get to Judas. We see Peter's remorse. And now when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders and people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and they led him away and they handed him over to Pilate the governor. Now this is critical because you have to understand that the high priests and the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, which is like that big court there, they have the right to try people for violating Jewish law. But their authority is limited in that they're not allowed to execute someone. That is a prerogative that the Romans preserve for themselves. You don't get to execute someone in a province. Only the Roman authority can do that. So they want to kill Jesus because they want to get rid of him. They want to get rid of him as a rival, as someone who they think affects their position politically, someone who is claiming to be a Messiah, someone who they think is going to mess with the status quo there. So they're going to deliver him over to Pilate. And when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned, I have betrayed innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? You shall see it yourself. And he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and left. And he went away and hanged himself. And the chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, it is not lawful to put this into the temple treasury, since the money was paid for blood, and they conferred together with the money and bought a potter's field. So I want you to get here. Why is Judas remorseful all of a sudden? Well, one possibility is it didn't really sink into him how bad what he was doing was. But there's another possibility. It might be possible that Peter thought Jesus was going to get roughed up, Jesus was going to have consequences, but that it wasn't going to get to the point of Jesus being executed. That very well could be that Judas didn't fully understand the full magnitude of what he was doing. And it also could be, Judas seems to be influenced by Satan at this point. There's all kinds of things that could be here. But the point is that he starts to have this feeling of condemnation. He starts to feel remorse. Now, notice the duplicity of the religious officials. They basically say, oh, you've betrayed innocent blood. What's that to us? We don't care. They know what they're doing. These are political operators. They are basically eliminating a potential rival. They know what they're doing. It doesn't matter whether or not he's innocent or not innocent. It doesn't matter. What matters is we're eliminating a political rival. Yet at the same time, they have the law, the tradition of the elders. we can't put this money in the sanctuary for the tradition of the elder. It's not right. Well, you know what else is not right? You murdering your rivals. That's not right, but you're going to do that. So just understand kind of the picture that we have here. So now let's get Jesus before Pilate. So now understand who Pilate is. Pilate is the governor. We actually know a lot about Pilate. He's the governor of Judea, proconsul or prefect of Judea. And he's ruling on behalf of the Romans. And he reigns here for about 10 years. He actually has a pretty substantial period where he rules in this area. It's pretty interesting that he manages to rule for this long. And so you would consider Pilate a fairly well-off, fairly important Roman official, not exactly the height of power, the very, very top, like senatorial class, like the very, very top class, but he's made a good career for himself within the Roman leadership. And what's going to happen is they're going to come to him, and as the governor, they're going to want to get him to execute Jesus. So he has a lot of political things that he has to take into consideration. On one hand, the chief priests have a lot of political authority. The leadership there in Jerusalem have a lot of pull. So if they get angry at Pilate and they report their frustration with Pilate to the right people in Rome, Pilate could find himself removed from power. That kind of thing happens fairly often. We actually have records of several officials being removed from power because local leaders and elites didn't like them, and they reported it to the leaders back in Rome. So Pilate has this dance. On one hand, he has the responsibility to bring about justice. On the other hand, he has the responsibility to maintain order. He does not want to be undercut, and he also doesn't want riots to break out. And we're going to see here that there are several places where it looks like a riot is very much possible and very much could happen. So let's see. Now, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "So you are the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he did not offer any answer. So he didn't defend himself against them. And then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they are testifying against you?" And still, he did not answer them in regard to even a single charge. So the governor was amazed. So Jesus is refusing to defend himself. This is something that has to happen. He knows this has to happen. He's dying for the sins of many. And now, at the Passover feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom he wanted. So this is the Gospels are the only record of this tradition. We don't actually know about this tradition. It seems to be a local Passover tradition. So basically what's going to happen here is that really Pilate kind of wants to have a way out. He sees that, okay, this guy it's more of a political thing. This guy really shouldn't be here. They're trying to get rid of him. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and give the opportunity to release a prisoner. And I'm going to put Jesus next to a guy, Barabbas, who clearly deserves the death penalty. Barabbas is someone who is a rebel leader. Jesus is most certainly not a rebel leader, but Barabbas is. So you have him basically saying, hey, look, I'll hand over one person, Barabbas or Jesus. And you have this very interesting thing, because Barabbas means son of the Father. So it's kind of ironic because Jesus is actually the son of the Father. Barabbas's name is son of the Father. So they get to choose which son are they going to pick. the true Son of God or someone who's not really Son of God. So, and who's really not a good person. So he gives them this opportunity. And he does it, why? Verse 18, for he knew that it was because of envy that they handed him over. So he wants to give an out. Like, look, this guy probably didn't do anything that's really worth it. I kind of don't want to make the religious leaders mad. That we've already had enough kind of argument between us. You can read that in Josephus. And he writes about the tension between Pilate and the religious leaders. So let me use this loophole of me releasing someone and see if that works. Now, ultimately, it's not going to work. And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent a message saying, I see that you have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night, I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. Now, this is a really, really big deal because dreams were a huge deal in the ancient world. If someone had a vision of a dream, it's something you'd listen to. And what's interesting here is you've actually already seen it in Matthew. If you go back to Matthew chapter 2, in Jesus's birth narrative, dreams happen a lot. There are a lot of dreams. Joseph and the Magi both have God communicate with them through dreams. So now you have the wife of Pilate communicate to him and say, look, I had this dream. So this is something that's very, very serious. So one, Pilate sees, well, look, they're just doing this out of envy. Two, say, oh, this is a righteous man. My wife is having dreams. Like that's something that you would not expect to just happen every day. That's something that needs to be paid attention to. And then you see this, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd. So again, these are crowds. These are not the crowds that are loyal to Jesus. They basically stacked the audience. They've got people who are loyal to them, and they've stacked the audience with people who are loyal to them. So the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. And the governor said to them, which of these two would you like me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. And Jesus said to them, then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Christ? And they said to him, crucify him. But he said, why? What evil has he done? And yet they kept shouting, crucify, crucify. So you have this picture of them being very insistent that he crucify him, but he doesn't really want to. He's very reluctant. And now when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water, he washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood, as you yourself shall see. And all the people replied, his blood shall be on us and our children. And then he released Barabbas for them. And after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. Now, a couple of things here. First of all, notice that Pilate was ready to kind of let him go. He kind of sees that he's being manipulated here, but he's in a weird political situation. He has a responsibility to maintain public order in Judea. Judea is strategically important because it's between the main area of Syria, which is a very, very important military hub and cultural hub, an economic hub for Rome, and Egypt, which is also really important agriculturally. And it's the main thoroughfare. So you can't have a riot breaking out that might lead to a revolt that leads to issues all in the city. So what we see here is once it looks like a riot's going to break out, he's got these politically powerful people who could report him. A riot's possibly going to break out. He says, fine, I'm going to wash my hands of this situation. That being said, we cannot take away the reality that Pilate knew that he was sentencing an innocent man to death and did it anyway. Yes, we can understand that there are political factors involved in Pilate's decision, but he's still, this whole I'm washing my hands of it, it's on you. No. Yeah, I mean, it's political theater. It's political theater. He's trying to have his cake and eat it too, as the saying goes. Also, another comment is important here. Some people take this particular thing and they see it as being very anti-Jewish, and they've used it to justify persecuting Jews, Jewish people. His blood shall be on us and our children, that phrase. That's not at all the point of this, because it's not all Jews that are betraying him. Of course, Jesus' apostles are Jewish. Jesus is Jewish. Of course, the crowds that the religious leaders were so afraid of who followed Jesus, they were mostly Jewish. We do know, when we've seen little hints throughout the book of Matthew, that Jesus is kind of moving towards the Gentiles in some areas. He's giving hints that if he's rejected, that the people who reject him, that's fine, because God's message is going to go out to others, those who are outside of the people of Israel. But this is not a full-scale rejection of all Jewish people. Of course, Paul is a Jew. And we understand that many Jews will still, and to this day, there are many Jews that have committed their faith to Christ. So he's going to turn him over. He's going to turn him over to be crucified, to be flogged and then crucified. So then the soldiers, verse 27, of the governor took Jesus to the praetorium. So this is the area where his guards would be, and gathered the whole Roman cohort to him. And they stripped him, and they put a red cloak on him, and they twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head, and they put a reed in his right hand, and they knelt down before him and mocked him, "Hail, King of the Jews." So that's part of this process of crucifixion, is they humiliate you. They humiliate you. Oh, you're the king? Oh, we'll treat you like a king. Here's a crown of thorns. Here's a reed that will be your scepter. Here's this garment we'll throw over you. And then they beat him and they mock him. Understand that crucifixion is not just a way to die. It's a way to be utterly humiliated in your death. That's really what crucifixion is. And when a person is crucified, what ends up happening, in Jesus' case, he got beaten really, really bad. He has to carry his cross. In fact, we see Simon of Cyrene here in verse 32 is going to help carry his cross. And then they bring him up to this place, Golgotha, in verse 33. And then they're going to nail him to this crossbeam, raise him up, and they're going to nail him to it. And the reality is that the way a person dies here is usually they suffocate. They don't die through bleeding or anything like that. It's that they slowly, after sitting out here with their arms up high for so long, it's hard for them to breathe, so they slowly suffocate. Within their own fluids and their own lungs, they slowly suffocate. There's also a lot of heat exhaustion and blood loss if they've been beaten like Jesus and all these other things. But it's a very, very slow and painful death. And it's meant to be extremely public, where everyone can look at you and say, this is what happens when people oppose wrong. Crucifixion is an extremely brutal and bloody way for a person to die. And when they crucified him, they divided his garments among themselves and cast lots. And you actually see this is a prophecy, Psalm 22, that this will happen. And at that time, you had two rebels Some people say thieves. The reality is the Greek word there doesn't really denote thieves, but more rebels. So people who are rebels against Roman authority were on either side of him. And in the midst of this, you have a continued mocking. The religious leaders, the Romans, they're going to mock him. And they're going to say all these things about him. Oh, you've saved others. Why can't he save himself? And they'll say all these kinds of things. Oh, you're the king of the Jews, huh? You know, look at you now, basically. And then now, from the 6th hour, darkness fell on all the land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those who were standing there heard it, and they said, this man is calling Elijah. And immediately one of them ran, taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine, he put it on a reed, and he gave it to him to have drink. But the rest of them said, let's see if Elijah comes to save him. So just understand, you're supposed to look at this, and it's pretty awful. Jesus has been beaten almost to death by scourging, by flogging. He's been forced to carry this cross until he can't carry it anymore. Then he's been nailed to the cross, lifted up high, and he's slowly being left to suffocate to death while people mock him. And this is someone who's done nothing wrong. He's healed people. This is the person that, as you read through the entire book of Matthew, he's healed people. He's set people free from demons. He's walked on water. He's calmed the winds and the waves. He has done anything. He's done everything to bring in the kingdom of God. And this is how the world mocks him. They drive thorns into his head. They beat him. They mock him. They humiliate him. So if you take Matthew as a whole, you see this real move of look at all he's doing. Jesus is accomplishing so much. No prophet's done this. No, Moses didn't do this. No angel's done this. Look how powerful he is. And then now here he is raised up on a cross, slowly suffocating to death. You're supposed to get to this part and be just in mourning. You're supposed to be overwhelmed with sadness when you get to the narrative part of this. And then Jesus cried out in a loud voice and gave up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. So the veil in the temple being torn is a symbol of, basically, there's two ways to view this. One way to view this is the sense in which there's a ripping of the veil, which separates the Holy of Holies from where ordinary people could go. The Holy of Holies was seen as where God's presence dwelt, and God's presence dwelt there, and then it rips, and you have where people could see into the Holy of Holies. So some people interpret that as being, well, now when Jesus dies, it destroys the separation between God and man. That's one way to view it. Another way to view it is that the presence of God has departed the temple, and that the curtain being torn from the top to the bottom is God basically saying, my presence, I'm tearing the curtain of the Holy of Holies because my presence is leaving the Holy of Holies. The temple no longer represents me. The temple is no longer my dwelling place. And that's the picture. Either of those could work. You're going to meet a lot of people that have one of those two opinions. The next thing we see is also the tombs were opened, and many bodies of saints who were fallen asleep were raised. Now, this is interesting. And then coming out of the tombs after the resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. And now, as for the centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the other things that were happening, they became extremely frightened and said, truly, this was the Son of God. So looking at this idea of people, saints, walking out of their tombs, this seems to be a foretaste of the resurrection. That's the picture here. This isn't like a mass zombie thing. These seem to be people who are actually, they were resurrected, not zombies. They're not walking out like they're undead or, dead bones and stuff. This seems to be very similar to what we see with Elisha when his bones are accidentally thrown into the wrong grave and a person is brought back to life. This seems to be somewhat what's happening, is that when Jesus dies, something so amazing happens, such a power release happens, that some of the saints, some of the people that had put their trust in God truly, they're raised from the dead. And it's a foretaste, it's a little taste of the resurrection that is to come. Now, this picture of the centurion saying, truly, this was the Son of God. People read that differently. Some people think that it's more meant to be ironic. I think based on what you see in Matthew, as far as Matthew concerns, I think he's saying this is sincere. Like the centurions realize something has happened here. And many women were there watching from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee while caring for him. Among them was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Mary, the sons and the sons of Zebedee. Now, when it was evening, a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus, he went to Pilate and asked for the body. So what you're going to have happening here is you're going to see Jesus being buried. And this is pretty important, because if Jesus doesn't get buried, then you don't end up having the evidence for the resurrection. If Jesus just gets kind of thrown in a mass grave, you don't have evidence for the resurrection. But here you have a clear attempt to bury Jesus. So Jesus is buried. And then you also have an attempt to say, well, he said he's going to rise again. We want to stop this from happening. So a guard is put around to prevent this from happening. And then ultimately, in spite of that guard, I'm kind of skipping over a lot here, they seal this, they seal the tomb, they protect it. And in spite of that, you're going to still see the resurrection happen. They cannot stop it from happening. And after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn, toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the tomb, and behold, a severe earthquake had occurred. And the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away a stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. And the guards shook in fear of him and became like dead men. And the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who has been crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, because just as he said, come, see the place where he was lying, and go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. Remember, he said that. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you. So you're going to have this really interesting scene. I'm actually going to skip down where he appears and and you have this kind of message and all this. And I'm going to get to the last part right before Jesus ascends into heaven. But the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, verse 16, to the mountain which Jesus had designated to them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some were doubtful. So Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to follow all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. This is what we call the Great Commission. This is the last little command that you see Jesus give them in this Great Commission. And he says, first of all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Again, this goes back to that picture of authority that we saw throughout Matthew. The importance of authority in God's kingdom, in the sense of we have God's kingdom in heaven where his will is done all the time. And then on earth, it's in rebellion against him. There's a rebellion against his authority on earth. And what we see here is Jesus saying, I have all authority. The crucifixion, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus was the final straw in giving him authority. Now, we need to preach that authority. Now, other people in the world need to be given the opportunity to submit to his authority as disciples. So go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations. So the role is for them to go. That's the command here. And they're going to make disciples. They're going to baptize them. And they're going to teach them to obey what he's commanded. So this is not just get people to accept Jesus. That's not the goal. You're making followers. The goal here is that, yes, you'll get people to accept Jesus, to turn their faith to Jesus. But then you're going to baptize those people and you're going to teach them how to obey Jesus. There's a growing up in the faith. Yes, they've put their trust in him. They've become followers of Christ. They've shown that reality through baptism in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But finally, we're going to teach them to do what God's commanded, to do what Jesus has commanded. So that's the ultimate goal, to have them grow up. And when we do this, understand that Jesus is with us to the end of the age. Jesus is with us as this process happens. And that's really how it ends. We see that start all the way back. God is doing something. He's bringing about his kingdom. And we see the end of Matthew saying, okay, the inaugurating event of God's kingdom on earth has started, the death, burial, and resurrection. Now you need to take the message out to the rest of the world to let them know that God is establishing his kingdom, and we need to turn towards our rightful king. That's the picture that we have here. And we know one day he's going to come back and he's going to bring his kingdom to full strength and power.